I'm Dan Sperling. I'm director of the Institute of Transportation Studies, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this seminar this week. So I would note this is the last seminar of the quarter. So those of you that are students that are enrolled, make sure you got to finish up your assignments very soon. So the next seminar will be after the break, the beginning of the first quarter on Friday, April 9th. So I am very pleased to welcome Darwin Moosavi to this seminar as our speaker for this week. He was appointed and currently serves as Deputy Secretary for Environmental Policy and Housing Coordination at the California State Transportation Agency, call it CalSTA. This is the agency that overarches, is above Caltrans, Department of Motor Vehicles, and a few other agencies. High-speed rail, I guess, as well. Before joining CalSTA, Darwin was the Sustainability Project Manager at Caltrans. So, and there he was leading initiatives on walking, biking, transit, zero-emission vehicles, and integration of equity into activities at Caltrans. And before that, he was a senior planner at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. That's the Governor's Office, reporting to the Governor, where he worked on various transportation policy issues that had to do with sustainable communities and reducing VMT. He got his BS from UC Davis in the Environmental Policy Analysis and Planning program. And so some of you, like Susan Handy and myself, are faculty in the department for that major. So we're great. It's wonderful to see a graduate succeeding, being a big success and moving on to bigger things. And then he also got a master's in urban and regional planning from Portland State, which is run, the research program there, the institute there is run by another one of our EPAP graduates as well, Jennifer Dill. So with that, Darwin, this is all yours. And if you can tell a little bit about yourself, because students are always thinking about how did they, where do they go from here? And I think you have a good story.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Sperling, for that introduction, and to UCITS for having me today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, so bear with me for a second while I get that set up. All right. Hopefully you all can see that.
Yes, we can. I can.
All right. Well, thank you again for having me and giving me a chance to speak to you all on my work. As Professor Sperling mentioned, I'll start off a little bit and talk a little bit about myself, and in particular, I want to talk about some of the work that we're doing at CalSTA on climate change tied to transportation infrastructure decisions and the role that transportation infrastructure can play in climate action. So as mentioned, I wanted to provide this little picture of the before times, because I always like thinking about the before times. So there I am, maskless, in person, getting sworn in my current role at CalSTA. You can see that it was a big hit when that happened. A whole 20 likes right there on that Twitter post. But I wanted to talk a little bit about CalSTA and our role in state government. So the state transportation agency where I work, as Dan mentioned, oversees numerous state agencies related to transportation, or state departments, I should say, rather, such as the California Highway Patrol, DMV, Caltrans, High-Speed Rail, the California Transportation Commission, amongst others. I think the unique thing about CalSTA is I always think of it as kind of the face of state government. I mean, when your average citizen thinks about state government and the role it plays. They often think about, the CHP officer, the DMV office they have to go to, the construction on the road. They're very kind of customer service oriented and outward facing functions of government. My work in particular is not very much tied to that customer service side of CalSTA. I am in a role that may not kind of naturally seem like a role that would exist at such an agency with those departments, but my portfolio is particularly tied to anything and all things related to climate change and our climate change related initiatives, both in our efforts to reduce greenhouse gases, but also to adapt to climate change. And this includes initiatives at mainly at the Department of Transportation, or Caltrans, which oversees and owns and operates the state highway system in the state of California. I do also get to work a little bit with high-speed rail, as that project is kind of coming underway, as well as the California Transportation Commission. But in terms of kind of my personal background and how I got here, I like starting, or I wanted to start with this picture because I feel like a picture can speak 1,000 words, and talk about my interests and what led me to my current role. So this is actually the street that I grew up on, and where I lived for most of my childhood and adolescence. This is in South San Jose. That little arrow is actually the house I grew up in. You'll see on that giant boulevard there. And I wanted to share this picture because, I think folks can kind of quickly kind of wrap their head around how someone who grew up in this kind of environment ended up interested in issues around air pollution, transportation, accessibility, climate change, urban planning. I think you can tell from this road it's rather wide. There's not a whole lot of bicycle or pedestrian access available. There was not, for even such a wide boulevard, there was no transit service where I lived. I listened to the cars roaring by and spewing air for most of my adolescence. And this is not an uncommon story. This is, I was not in this is at the time was probably a middle income to lower middle income neighborhood in San Jose. I for the most part, grew up having what I needed and got access to decent education by being enrolled in a school outside of my neighborhood, a public school outside of my neighborhood that I got to attend. But the kind of street conditions and realities from a transportation standpoint and an environmental standpoint, I think are conditions that a lot of people who grew up in suburban developments around the state or around the country have experienced, and something that a lot of us are familiar with. But it gives you a little bit of a sense of my interest and my personal drive of the reason I'm interested in improving transportation. So a little bit of my professional story in logos. As Professor Sperling mentioned, I'm an Aggie, and I'm happy to be back here and able to present to you all. I was just reflecting this morning as I was putting my slide deck together about how it seems like not that long ago that I was actually taking a class from Professor Sperling. I think Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor, and we were in the midst of passing SB 375 landmark legislation at the time. And that was kind of my first exposure to a lot of this work that I now work on. So after graduating from Davis, I graduated during the Great Recession and decided it was a good time to get a master's degree. So I went up to Portland State and did that. I got a chance to work in community planning, long-range community planning, both while I was there and for a bit afterward at the city of Portland up in Oregon, which was a great place to learn about great transportation solutions, but also was a place that opened my eyes up to the various equity issues and inequities that oftentimes actually exist in my mind the most, both in areas that have been neglected from a transportation perspective, but almost equally so in areas where we have done a good job to serve transportation, but haven't thought about how to make sure particularly disadvantaged communities have access to those same services that we're looking to bring to others. When I came down to California and got involved in state government, I first started at Caltrans, working on long-range planning issues, and then did a bunch of bouncing around between various state agencies. Eventually, essentially just taking any opportunity that I saw ahead of me that I thought could help me develop and advance both my understanding of the issues and my career. And I've been lucky enough to have various opportunities kind of at the intersection of land use and transportation policy tied to climate change. And so that's kind of the frame I think about the work that I've gotten to work on, is really about those intersections and rooted in the idea of trying to create equitable and accessible, sustainable communities. And so I always like showing illustrations like this of a vision of what multimodal, higher density environments could look like, and help visualize a lot of what we're talking about. This image, I should note, is in Dana Point, and some illustrations of Dana Point, which I would not characterize as a community that I guess I should say I would characterize it as a community that's fairly exclusive and not one that is open to and accessible to all races and incomes. So I think that's often a challenge that we have in implementation of a lot of these policies that I'm happy to talk more about as we move forward. Here's another bit of an illustration of the elements that it takes to build sustainable communities, and a lot of what I've worked to bring to fruition through the various opportunities that I've had to work on. But at the root of all of this, I think going to the bigger picture lens around climate and the work at a higher level policy level that I've been leading and working on is really about the dependence that we have as a society on driving, and much of the images that I was putting there, putting in front of you. I think a common theme there is short distances, access to various options of travel, various housing options and densities, ability to easily get around without having a car. And so if that's the vision from both from a public health perspective and a climate perspective, and the need to reduce our dependence on driving, it brings us to a metric that many of you may be familiar with, vehicle miles traveled, that I think can be a good and strong indicator for thinking about whether we're moving in the right direction or wrong direction on building those types of communities. As driving continues to increase and dependence on driving increases, and people drive longer distances for more hours of the day, and more people do so, I think that's a decent indicator that vision that we kind of outlined there is one that we're not necessarily moving towards in a meaningful way. And climate change is one of, but I think the key lens that the state cares about creating that vision and reducing vehicle miles traveled. And in particular, you'll see here with the graph here that transportation is a key pollutant when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. And in California, if you think about transportation as a life cycle, it's about 50% of all of our emissions. Tailpipe emissions alone is about 40% of our emissions. So for someone who works on climate change issues in transportation, this is kind of a critical part of the overall picture. In particular, as we think about at the state, our efforts to address climate change and tackle the transportation piece in particular, I always think of it as there's essentially two things we can do when it comes to thinking about our emissions. Understanding that most 40% of them come from vehicle tailpipes. You can make the cars cleaner, and you can make us use cars less or drive fewer miles in total. And you'll see in terms of our projections of where we're going to get reductions, the majority of those reductions are expected to come from the technology pieces. And I'll get a little bit into this in a bit in terms of what the governor's done to further those goals. But just as important as that reduction from technology and fuels is reductions from VMT, which can be a lot harder to get, but are critical because without them, we won't meet our climate goals or our targets. And certainly, as you can see from the chart, even with the current goals we have on VMT reduction and technology, we don't get to carbon neutrality by 2050. And so it will take even more from VMT to potentially to get there. The reason this is so critically important is not just because we need those reductions, but also because we can, blow our chance to have our zero emission vehicle reductions be meaningful if VMT continues to go on the trend that it's going now, which is upwards. So as you see here, this is a slide that articulates kind of the general trajectory of VMT per capita, kind of put in perspective with kind of our anticipated, what we expected through our planning efforts to be getting in terms of VMT projections by certain times. And so we're not on the right track there. And then, this is, given that we're in a pandemic and a lot has changed, this is a little outdated, and it's particularly about travel to work, but this mode shift or mode share in general holds up pretty well across various types of trips that Californians take. But you can see that the driving alone is generally still the major way that Californians get around the state. And so when we think about VMT reduction, I always think about two different aspects to how we can get those reductions and make changes to really move the needle on VMT. And those are through land use solutions and transportation solutions. On the land use side, which I think is probably the place where we can both get bigger gains, but are even slower, as slow as transportation solutions are even slower to get those gains, because we're talking about physically changing the built landscape of communities. On the land use side, we're really talking about policies that help bring people closer to their destinations. How do you increase accessibility, access to destinations through more affordable housing in economic rich areas and job rich areas, more jobs closer to where people live, reducing the distances that folks have to go through our land use decisions and our housing decisions. And then the other side of VMT reduction is through transportation options. Regardless of where people live and how long those distances are, if we're really talking about reducing their dependence on driving, they need to have access to other ways to get around. And this is where a lot of the work I'm doing now is really focused on. And so I want to take some time today to kind of dig into that with you and talk about much of what we're doing there. So in particular, we're working on at CalSTA what we're calling our Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure. And this really is going to be our roadmap, particularly tied to transportation investments, of how we bring those various transportation options to fruition for Californians in a meaningful way and push the needle further on creating those options. So regardless of what those land uses look like, that people have access to and options to get around their community in ways that doesn't depend on a vehicle, or a privately owned vehicle, I should say. And the kind of impetus and reason behind our climate action plan goes back to an executive order that the governor issued back in September of 2019, EON 1919, which asked CalSTA, my agency, to leverage state transportation spending to help meet climate goals. And it asked us to do this in particular ways. In particular, the executive order asked us to focus on planning and programming, and aligning planning and programming in the transportation space with our climate change scoping plan, which sets the pathway for how we meet our climate goals. It asked us to specifically focus on reducing VMT by having transportation investments support infill development. So it acknowledged the role that transportation options can play and transportation infrastructure can play in actually getting those land uses we talked about to come to fruition. If you develop in a way that is car oriented, your land uses will respond to that. And so, kind of flipping the equation and thinking about transportation as a driver of those land use decisions is what we're called on to do there. It also asks us to think about reducing congestion through innovative strategies that encourage people to shift from cars to other modes of travel. I think this is really a nod to thinking about both demand management strategies and tools that we know we have in the toolkit, or we're working to get in our toolkit, such as pricing strategies and roadway pricing strategies, thinking about the cost of driving and not only driving but also parking, and how that can influence people's decisions to use a car or other modes, but also thinking about the impact of highway capacity expansion and roadway expansion, and what additional capacity does in terms of encouraging additional driving. And I think this is a concept that's been long talked about in research, the concept of induced travel, but long ignored by policymakers. So the governor's kind of calling on us to think about that. Next, it calls on us to fund infrastructure that encourages transit use, walking and biking. And finally, as we implement these various policies, to think about mitigating for increased costs to low-income Californians, particularly when you're talking about potential sticks like pricing, and not just although they can also be incentives. How do we implement those types of tools in a way that doesn't put additional increased burden on our most vulnerable Californians? So in addition to that executive order, I mentioned earlier that the governor also issued an executive order targeted at the other side of the coin, the zero emission vehicle side of the coin. And so there are robust, as you see here, zero emission vehicle goals and targets now that the state is hoping to meet. We're hoping, or we're working towards getting to a 100% zero emission vehicle fleet by 2035 for light duty vehicles and 100% by 2045 for heavy duty vehicles. That same executive order also called on CalSTA to continue working on providing transportation options through our implementation of EON 1919, and in particular calls out the fact that even with the implementation of zero emission vehicles, our climate change issue won't be solved the moment all vehicles are for sale are clean, because there'll be decades thereafter that will continue to have combustion engine vehicles still on the roads. You know, this is about a mandate and sale of new vehicles, and so we'll continue to have polluting cars on the road for decades to come. So going back to the scope of our action plan and our work, EON 1919, as I mentioned, called on us to leverage funds. It particularly called out the number $5 billion of state funds. And the programs listed here make up what the executive order was referencing. And what these state transportation funding programs have in common is that they're all in some way, shape, or form programs where the state directly gets to select or scope or recommend specific projects for selection. So transportation funding, which, you know, I could do a whole nother lecture on, because it's its own kind of complicated world, is made up of a lot of different local, regional, and state-driven programs and projects, different sources of revenue that make up the world of transport, and federal as well, that make up the world of transportation. The governor is essentially calling on us to specifically think about the state programs where we have the ability to shape what projects look like or what projects are chosen, and use those as a lever to influence the overall transportation project planning and programming sphere. So in doing so, and wanting to take on that challenge of thinking about, you know, how we can prioritize our investments differently, we've come up with what we're calling our investment framework. And the investment framework includes 10 guiding principles that lay out what we think is kind of the ideal focus of where we should be spending our transportation dollars. We've made it very clear that these are just guiding principles because, you know, given the kind of realities and dynamics of transportation planning and their locally and regionally driven nature, it's not going to be overnight or automatic that we'll be able to spend all our money in this way. But this is kind of the goalpost that we've put out there and what we're working towards in terms of what we'd like to see those expenditures go towards. And so the first three of those 10 guiding principles I think of as the what. You know, what are we actually looking to invest in terms of clean transportation options? And so in particular, at a statewide level and the investments we make at the state, we're interested in building towards an integrated statewide rail and transit network, which I think can be, you know, the backbone across the state of a clean transportation system. In addition, we want to invest in networks of safe and accessible bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure in communities across the state. You know, I think this is important everywhere, but from a state perspective, particularly the role that we play in areas that may not have a lot of resources of their own, smaller communities, rural communities, smaller regions, those of which maybe don't even have robust or can't support robust transit networks. We think that those types of investments in those places are critical. And then also, you know, vehicles will continue to be a key aspect of transportation in California. And as we work on the ZEV portion of transportation, we want to make sure that our investments are including investments in light, medium, and heavy duty zero emission vehicle infrastructure to support that transition. And then these next 7 guiding principles, I often think of as the how we do the what that I mentioned earlier. So these are supportive guiding principles, which I think offer a frame to think about our work through and ensure that we're doing all of these things as we're building out that transit, active transportation, and ZEV network. The first one is really about thinking about the public health harms, particularly to disadvantaged communities. What are we doing and how are we thinking about ensuring that we're maximizing public health benefits to disadvantaged communities across the state, and at the same time minimizing any harms that might be coming from various transportation initiatives. Next, we want to make sure that as we're doing our work, and safety has always been and will continue to be a big part of why we do transportation improvements. But we need to make sure that we're thinking about safety from a standpoint of reducing fatalities and severe injuries, particularly to what we call vulnerable road users, such as cyclists and pedestrians, which are both disproportionately impacted on our roadways from a fatality and injury standpoint, and also it's a cyclical effect of it's difficult to get folks interested and excited about walking and biking when they feel more at risk on our roadways and don't feel safe. So safety is critical to seeing that mode shift, as well as kind of the general overall goals of reducing fatalities in California. Next, as we do our work to reduce emissions and provide options that help reduce carbon emissions, we also need to be thinking about climate risk and the risk to the transportation system and our communities posed by climate change. We know a lot of those risks are already here, whether it's sea level rise or wildfire risk. And so incorporating physical climate risk assessment in our project development will be critical. Next, as I mentioned earlier, and I think this is one of the most challenging aspects of the plan to implement, is we're focused on promoting projects that do not show the ability to significantly increase passenger vehicle travel. So this is really about shifting away from highway capacity projects and widening our roadways as the first tool, and thinking about what are other ways we can manage congestion that doesn't lead to further adoption of driving and increased mode shift in driving. Next, I mentioned the role of land use. We want to make sure that our transportation investments are supporting compact infill development across the state. That can look different in different regions and different parts of the state, but something we're committed to working on. And then the flip side of that equation is also make sure that our transportation projects are protecting natural and working lands, and that they're not leading to conversion of lands or pressuring lands for conversion. And then finally, as we work on our zero emission vehicle transportation infrastructure deployment, we need to really be thinking about networks and systems, particularly when it comes to freight, and be planning for a zero emission vehicle or zero emission freight system as we deploy our projects. So, those are all great goals, but what does it mean, and what are we actually doing to bring all that to fruition? For us, what that looks like is looking kind of across the transportation project delivery pipeline, or I should say the various phases, particularly when it comes to planning and programming, and thinking about what changes are needed to see our projects and the outcomes of what we're funding look a lot more like those guiding principles that we set forward. And I say this, and maybe I'm biased because of my planning roots, but to me, it all starts with better planning. I think this implementation effort on our action plan has gotten a lot of attention for changes it wants to make on the programming end, for how we choose our projects and which projects we fund and prioritize and program for delivery. But at the end of the day, if we don't have a good pipeline of projects, if we're not doing planning to have the appropriate solutions on the table, there's nothing we can do on the programming end, because we simply wouldn't have the right solutions to even fund. We certainly need to be putting a lot more attention from a planning perspective, and we're working with Caltrans and all of their statewide planning efforts to do so. But at the same time, as I mentioned, programming and not waiting for the long lead time of transportation projects, but thinking about what decisions we're making today to prioritize out of the options that we do have will be critical. And so, here's just a list of the types of things we're looking to include in our plan. As I mentioned, we want to align our planning initiatives, and these are specifically our state-driven planning initiatives at Caltrans and CalSTA with the Capita framework. We want to update program guidelines to strengthen alignment with the Capita framework and our climate goals. We're looking to improve existing agency processes and practices to remove different barriers to accelerate a lot of this work. Really looking at existing red tape and where we can streamline delivery of projects in particular. And where necessary and needed, we'll be pursuing authority for new initiatives. Given the current economic crisis that we're still in, this is a rather difficult thing to do right now, and we're really focused on working within the existing programs at a statewide level that we have, but we are willing to request authority for new initiatives that we think are critical to bringing a lot of this to fruition. And then finally, we need to coordinate actions that are led by other sectors that are critical for this plan's success. I mentioned the land use side of the equation. Through this plan, we're going to be working to make sure that we're coordinated in our messaging at a statewide level and the actions we're taking to have our land use solutions and our transportation solutions work in sync with each other. And then, I wanted to as we wrap up here and before opening it up for questions, just reflect a little bit on this work and the challenges and opportunities I see in it. So we're right now at the place where we're actually releasing a draft plan, the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure, next week, and we'll be going into a public comment phase. We've been working with our stakeholders and doing outreach on this effort for about a year now, but I think we're entering a critical phase here where we'll be receiving comments on the specific actions that we've put forth in hopes to finalize a plan and start implementing by this summer. And so as I kind of reflect on various challenges and opportunities, there's a few things I wanted to highlight. So on the challenges front, as I mentioned, the long lead time for transportation projects, just how long it takes to develop and deliver projects is really a key challenge in shifting a project pipeline. There are numerous projects, endless lists of projects that have been in the works for 20, 30, sometimes even 40 years that may not be reflective of the goals we're trying to solve today. But given both politically and financially, the level of investment and energy that's gone into those projects, it's rather difficult to change course and move on from something like that, even if the goals no longer align with what we're trying to accomplish. Kind of along those same lines, most of transportation planning and project development is led at a local and regional level. So for the state to try to think about and prioritize and get down to the level of detail of like what types of projects we're really trying to put forward, can be rather difficult and challenging, both from a political perspective, but it also, just from a practical perspective. And then, finally, as you all know, as is the case in everything, not just transportation, we have a very diverse state, and the conditions and transportation options around the state are so vastly different, and the solutions can look very different. And so finding an approach that works across the state is challenging, and the solutions are going to be different in different parts of the state. And we're also, I think, various regions of the state are in different places in terms of their readiness to deliver on some of what we're talking about. But to end on a positive note, in terms of opportunities, I think what really has me encouraged about a lot of this work is that through better transportation planning and land use planning, I see the ability to address multiple objectives through kind of the same mechanisms, whether they're around climate or health or equity. And so I think you can make a lot of meaningful impact with infrastructure changes. And then another opportunity I see in this work is that California has long been a leader on climate-related issues. We're being seen as a leader in this space on transportation infrastructure. There's a lot of DOTs across the state, and even the federal government who are looking to us to take their cues on what's possible on these fronts. So it's really, I think, an exciting opportunity to continue showing leadership on how we can think about these issues. And finally, talking about that federal piece, it'll, I think, be a tremendous help to these types of efforts as we have renewed federal leadership on infrastructure. Just over the last few weeks, we've heard a lot out of the new U.S. DOT Secretary Buttigieg, around the role that climate and equity will play in transportation decisions at a federal level. And having that type of leadership at that level, I think will be a huge opportunity for our work moving forward. So with that, I'd appreciate the time to present to you all, and we'll turn it over back to Dr. Sperling to get some questions.
Great. Thank you very much. That was a good overview. I can't wait to dig in a little bit about what the state is really doing, could be doing, should be doing. And we have a few questions already coming in, but let me encourage students, especially in chat, if you can either put your question in or raise your hand or just speak up would be fine also. We do have a simple question just about some of the details or assumptions from James Giller. He asked just about the assumptions behind the greenhouse gas reduction scenarios and VMT reduction, like, what grid mix do you use, for instance?
Sure. So much of what I pulled and shared with you all today comes from the Air Resources Board's mobile source strategy, and is then embedded into the broader climate change scoping plan. In terms of in terms of specific data sources on the various pieces, if you're interested, I provided my contact information. Happy to follow up and get into the details.
Thanks. And so Ray has a question. Ray, how about you speak up?
Thank you. Thank you, Darwin. It was really interesting presentation. I hear and I read a lot of great policies and great decisions being made, but I wonder, is there any actions or decisions being made regarding how we can streamline all those efforts to get the most out of it and have a better, unique and unified action toward this problem?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the question. And, I think the big challenge in the space of land use and transportation planning, in my mind, generally speaking, is that so much of the decision making is driven locally. And I think, there's obviously a lot of, key benefits to that in terms of communities really driving their own decisions, and having an ability to shape, their needs. What it becomes more challenging is, how do you then kind of embed kind of broader, larger, more holistic goals in that local decision making, I think that's a constant challenge for climate-related initiatives when it comes to transportation and land use. I think in terms of specific actions that we're taking, through our plan, we're hoping that the various changes that we make then result in local and regional governments having to think about their prioritization of their projects and their efforts, and that our leadership, hopefully will actually translate to broader changes or rethinking of what local priorities should be pursued first. I think limited resources from a transportation standpoint and a transportation funding standpoint are both a challenge, but also in some ways an opportunity to really think about, we don't have the money for everything. So how do we think about where to put the limited money we do have? And if the state shows, I believe if the state shows leadership on where we're willing to put some of our own funds, it may help signal the local and regional decision makers, where they're going to have additional support and help based on where they put their money. So I think that's kind of the premise around all of this, and so the specific actions that we take around where to put our funding will hopefully lead to more action on the ground, and that's what we're really hoping for.
Thank you.
Okay, you've kind of put yourself on the line with this VMT. So I think we have, so James Giller wants to follow up. He was asking about the grid, but he wants to dig down a little bit more. So go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Darwin. Thanks for the presentation. I was just surprised by how the plot that you showed near the beginning of your presentation, how small the reduction from lowering VMT was displayed there compared to changing fuel types. And I would think that to have such a discrepancy would require, a very clean grid. And could you perhaps expand a bit on why there's such a discrepancy? I think that lowering VMT would be more important for reducing emissions.
Yeah, that's a great question. So to expand a little bit about on that in that chart, I think a couple things to keep in mind. I think that chart is particularly mapping out the pathway we see to getting our reductions, and I view that as different than what you could accomplish with a different mix of reductions, if that makes sense, right? So if we focused on, a much more substantial amount of VMT reductions, I think VMT reductions can also bring, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of benefits from a public health, livability, equity, other goals, other co-benefits beyond climate that we'd get from VMT reduction that I think is really critical. However, we're lucky to be in a state that is a leader and wanting to take bold progressive action on zero emission vehicles, and has made our pathway to meeting our climate goals on the transportation front a lot simpler by putting strong targets for zero emission vehicles in place, and mandating that the sale of zero emission vehicles will get to 100%, or 100% of our vehicles will be ZEVs by 2035 for light duty and 2045 by heavy duty, which makes the pathway and the heavy lifting that VMT has to do a lot easier. However, I think it's important to note that even that small sliver, what it looked like a small sliver on that chart of VMT reductions will be challenging. And one thing I mentioned is, to me, the biggest threat from the VMT standpoint of not doing anything is in the increases that we could potentially see if we choose to ignore that side of the equation, which could make that pathway a lot harder. Because even if we're seeing major ZEV adoption, if the combustion engine vehicles that remain on the road are driving more and more miles over time, that can be a problem and make that pathway even harder to get to.
Okay, here's another stab at you, Darwin, on this issue. So this comes from Lynn Goldsmith. Lynn, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question? Are you still there?
Okay. I'm here. He sort of tried to answer it. I don't know that there is an answer. I am very aware of how long these projects, the freeway projects, the arterial expansion projects are in the pipeline. And Caltrans has a district or the headquarters has a new leader who is very progressive and definitely thinks about climate. But how, when the districts are all independent of each other, how can he really influence policy to take a step back, reevaluate all the projects that have already been approved, because they have such a long planning time? How can we step back and say, whoa, enough already. Let's put that money somewhere else. Cap City Corridor, that's one example. There's lots of them.
Yeah, Lynn, I mean, this is the heart of the question, right? This is the crux of the issue, and will continue to be a challenge. I think what our plan is trying to do, as I mentioned, is two things. One, create a pathway where we do different types of plannings for the new projects that we start. So, we don't have the same problem 20 years from now. And the new projects that get going look different. But for those projects already in the pipeline, the key lever is the funding. And so that's, in terms of when we talk about prioritizing our money differently, what we're trying to signal is that we don't have enough money to complete everything that's in the pipeline. It's just a fact. There isn't enough funding to build out every highway expansion that is in a regional plan somewhere across the state, or is being pursued by a Caltrans district or wherever it may be. And so, as we both shift towards wanting to invest in other things, as we mentioned today, in other modes of transportation, that means we're going to have to think seriously and hard about the benefits that come from the various highway capacity expansion projects that we have in front of us, and think about how we prioritize our funding for those types of projects. And I think it's very hard to stop a lot of forward progress on some of these projects, and there's just momentum that carries a lot of these forward. But I do think that this shift will hopefully at least result in projects that are earlier in planning phases saying, wait a minute, how is this thing ever going to get built? Do we continue investing money in this? What does that look like? Where will that money come from? And those types of questions, I think, will lead to some changes.
Thank you.
Okay, here's a little different question from Ellen Dudna. Ellen, do you want to unmute? Still there? Okay, let me ask it. It's a good question. So is this, I didn't catch how you pronounce that acronym, CAPTI?
Whichever way you want, Dan. CAPTI, CAPTI. It's a made-up word, so whichever one you like better.
Okay, will the CAPTI address the issue of managed retreat at the coast? In other words, as sea levels rise? And it does seem like the cost benefit of continuing to invest in corridors should consider the issues of equity you mentioned, as well as climate risk. I don't know if we will need to make some hard choices with regard to our built environment. Wonder how the CAPTI may anticipate these.
Great question. And so the framework that we're kind of putting in place and the actions that we'll have in CAPTI are essentially going to lead to Caltrans in particular thinking about and assessing the risk of various pieces of infrastructure to climate stressors. So it will certainly include sea level rise issues, and in doing that analysis, and right now we're just talking about analysis. I think we'll start to outline the different pathways, if you will, for different pieces of infrastructure, and I think that's the first step to really kind of starting that conversation across the state for what happens to different pieces of infrastructure. We know we don't have the funding to harden, raise, relocate, and move every piece of infrastructure that's going to be susceptible to one of the climate stressors in the future. It's going to take, I think, a lot more conversations and planning to put those different options out there, to be upfront about the risks that are posed to various pieces of infrastructure, to then lead to, I think, what will ultimately be in-depth planning conversations to, what to do in various communities. And I agree that at the forefront of that should be, thinking about equity implications and access in and out of various communities. So I appreciate the question.
Okay, so I'm going to take the prerogative to ask you a couple of questions. So the first question is just a yes, no. So I've heard the executive director of SANDAG, who used to be executive director of SCAG, the whole Los Angeles region, Hassan Igrata, the MPO there, and he said, this was even 2 or 3 years ago, and this is for the LA area, we are not going to build any new roads. We're finished with roads. And that was Los Angeles. Can you imagine a day in the next 5 years, let's say, where the state or CalSTA will say the same thing? This is yes or no.
No, and I'd like to explain why, because I think fundamentally, I think it's the wrong question to be answering. And I think it's actually kind of a little bit of the crux of the problem that we're in. And I think we're a little too fixated on the idea of whether we'll build more highway capacity or not, instead of thinking about what we're really after, which is about rethinking the solutions and the problem we're trying to solve for. And so, you know, there may be and probably will be situations in which, you know, highway capacity will continue to be, in a limited fashion, the best solution for a particular issue. But what we're, I guess, suggesting is that we should think critically about what we're trying to do and where we're going, and think about the various tools in the toolbox that we have to get there. And you know, I think highway capacity has been a tool of first resort, and we're trying to turn it into a tool of last resort, which in and of itself is a big shift and change. But you know, I don't envision us getting to a point or even aiming for the goal of saying, you know, no more. I think that would be as you know, as a planner, I don't think, you know, restricting at a policy level tools like that for solving local and transportation problems is necessarily a healthy conversation to have.
You've become very diplomatic. I'm impressed. So here's okay.
That
So
wasn't believable, Dan?
What's that?
That wasn't believable. Is that what you're trying to tell me?
It was believable. It actually was very practical and appropriate. Anyone have a question? Because I have one more question, but any students or anyone have a question they'd like to ask? Okay, so here's my other question is, you highlighted two goals. One is reduce VMT. The other is being responsive to environmental justice, you know, social justice, mobility justice concerns and goals. But if you're going to help out people living in underserved communities, almost by definition, that means you're going to serve them more. So doesn't that run contrary to the VMT goal? This is kind of a trick question. So
yeah, I think the trick in that question is serve them more with what? And I would say, you know, I think there's an inherent inequity in a car-centric view of transportation. You know, both from the standpoint of the cost burdens of vehicle ownership, and the, you know, various restrictions that brings, but also, you know, I think we've you know, and this is where I think the land use and transportation issues meet, and you're, you know, very well steeped in this yourself, Dan, but I think the fact that we've allowed for development of communities to only think about housing cost and not access, and made our overall goal of affordability around how cheap a unit of housing is, without thinking about where it is and what it has access to and what opportunities it gives people and how long people have to drive to get there, and separating those two out has been kind of the crux of the issue. So I think, you know, transportation access and particularly creating additional options for folks, and thinking about how you reduce our dependence on driving and how you overall, you know, reduce VMT is very much at the heart of our equity vision and how we get to a more equitable California. I will say that, you know, I think the one piece that is tricky is to get that VMT reduction. There's a lot of, you know, positive incentives and things you could do in terms of, you know, building affordable housing in the right places and providing multimodal transportation options. However, there are tools in the toolkit that such as pricing in particular, that I think we need to be we need to think about in a holistic fashion when we think about implementation, and think about their impacts to particularly disadvantaged and low-income communities. I think pricing can actually be a very equitable tool if we talk about mobility pricing, generally, right? How do you price transportation access? Making modes of transportation like public transportation and more sustainable modes of transportation more affordable for Californians at the same time that you're thinking about pricing single occupancy vehicles or modes of transportation that have a higher entry cost to get to, I think is the way you get there. But I don't see VMT reduction and equity as odds with each other.
Yeah, it shouldn't be, but and I think kind of what we've been working on at ITS at UC Davis is how can we use all our current vehicles and modes in a more intensive way? How do you boost ridership on transit? How do you use the pooled services for the TNCs, Uber and Lyft and Via and so on? How do you encourage the bicycling, scooters, walking, and all of those things provide accessibility as well as some of the land use options that you mentioned. So I think, I did ask that specifically because I think we need to, in the public world, and even for us in research world, appreciate, that people can perceive them to be in conflict, and that we do have good responses and good answers and good ways of dealing with it. A simple way I express it is we want to reduce VMT, but increase PMT, passenger miles traveled, and which is probably a better metric for, mobility and accessibility than VMT. So anyway, that was our UC Davis 3 revolutions take on it. Okay, we have any other questions from anyone? Okay, Christina, did you want to?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, I just want to ask, what policies, kind of just looking into the future of mobility and going off of what Dan said, kind of decreasing VMT but increasing PMT. What policies at the state level might be needed to help the sustainable adoption of shared automated vehicles at the local level?
That's a great question. I think there are many roles that the state plays when it comes to shared AVs. I think this could be its own kind of talk and discussion. What I'll say at a high level, though, I think bringing together our goals of around climate and our goals to increase access and mobility for folks on the ground, as well as thinking, I think the future of labor and automation is also part of this, are all going to be critical pieces of policy that are going to have to come together to think about, what is the state's framework and role around these things. We're seeing some of that already play out through actions around at the CPUC or DMV. I think what I'll say from, I guess, my more narrow perspective of the work that I'm working on from a VMT perspective, I think landing the shared component and incentivizing the shared component of AVs will be critical to not undermining our overall goals of VMT reduction. So I think the state can play a key role there in terms of specific policies and levers. That conversation gets pretty complicated pretty quickly, but it's definitely an important question to be thinking about.
Well, thank you, Darwin. Yes. So anyone have any closing questions or thoughts? All right, let's thank Darwin. Maybe unmute yourself and let's thank him for coming and spending the time with us and giving us a very insightful talk on a state perspective on these challenges. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone, for having me. I appreciate it. Hopefully next time I'll get to be actually back at UC Davis versus on the screen, but appreciate it nonetheless.
Yes, that's what we want too.